1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. When one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more then matters pertaining to this life? So if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle disputes between the brothers, but a brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers? To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? But you yourselves wrong and defraud, even your own brothers. So what's been happening in the passages we've looked at this week and last week is Paul is bringing to the attention of the church that there are some issues that they have to deal with as a church. These are things that you can't ignore and you can't just not worry about. You have to address it. But the way that he's telling them to address it is to address it in-house. These are not issues that you need to seek outside counsel for, but because the church is a very different entity, is a very different organization, unlike anything else in the world, you need to deal with these in-house. I mean, think about the military. When it comes to military business, they hold military court. They don't bring military business outside the military because they have a different way of dealing with themselves. They have a different way of dealing with their family in the army, a way that works for them. And in the same way, the church needs to have a very different way of dealing with one another in a biblical way, in a way that both encompasses love and truth. The church has a way of dealing with issues that is focused on preserving unity, that is focused on restoring, that is focused on bringing people to repentance, and not just achieving justice. So last week, the topic we talked about, anyone remember what was going on in the church? It was pretty controversial, like tabloid-worthy. There was a man sleeping with his mother-in-law. Now that seems really crazy, but back then you have to remember that women married quite young. So there is a chance that if this is the second marriage, that the mother-in-law was maybe the same age as the son. But what was the church's reaction to this guy sleeping with his mother-in-law? They were proud. They were almost saying, look at how permissive we are. Look at how non-legalistic we are. Look at how accommodating and accepting we are as a church. So that was last week. The passage we're talking about this week is dealing with believers who are suing one another in court. So they're bringing issues that occur within the church and bringing it into court. But let's be very clear. We're not talking about criminal situations. We're not talking about murder or sexual abuse or theft or those sort of things you need to bring to legal action, okay? If there's sexual abuse within the church, unfortunately the church has tried to cover it up, but what should really happen in those criminal situations is you should bring it to the criminal system. But what Paul is talking about here is what's happening is there are more civil lawsuits. Maybe you loan money to somebody and they haven't paid you back. Or maybe somebody is spreading false rumors about you that is in some way hurting your reputation. Or, I don't know, maybe there's someone in the church you just don't like because they smell, or I don't know, right? But these are things that are not super, super serious. And in verse 5, it's kind of interesting because Paul says, I say this to your shame. A few weeks ago, he wanted to make sure that they didn't feel ashamed by what he was writing. Now he actually wants them to feel ashamed, to point out how ridiculous it is what they're doing. And he puts these two issues side by side to show us how backwards the church has been reacting. Now think about this. The man sleeping with his mother-in-law. That is a situation where they should have confronted him. That is a situation where they should have brought him under the guidelines of church discipline that we talked about last week. And instead, they just let it happen. Look how accepting we are. That's a pretty serious thing, and they did nothing. On the other hand, there's these less serious issues of maybe someone owing money or some minor offense, and instead of just handling those minor issues less formally, they overreact and they go to court. And Paul's pointing out, these two don't make sense. The way you're reacting to these situations don't make sense. And he says, if there are conflicts within the church, you should not bring it to court. He says it's better to be wronged. Better to be wronged. Because there's no amount of money, there's no amount of satisfaction that you can get and achieve that's worth the disunity and the disruption you're bringing to the kingdom of God. Now, hopefully, as far as I know, we in this church never have conflict to the point where we want to bring one another to court or bring some sort of legal issue to this. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but here's what I know. There will be disagreements within the church because we're humans, because we have different opinions, because we have our own agendas. There will be conflicts. I don't think the church is ever going to be conflict-free, and that's fine. But how we handle disagreements and minor offenses is critical, because here's what I know. Most great empires don't fall because some outside enemy conquered them. Most great empires fall because of the dysfunction within. The Great Wall of China, which I've never seen, and probably won't because the visa is expensive, but that did a great job keeping the Mongols out and preserving the safety of the Chinese dynasties. That did a great job keeping things out. But dynasty after dynasty fell, and if you look at why it fell, it wasn't because of outside enemies, it was because of dysfunctions within. It was because of corruption or poor leadership or people with their own agenda. And so the church needs to be very careful how we handle these minor disagreements and these minor issues that inevitably occur within one another. So Paul says in verse 1, when one of you has a grievance against one another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Now that word for unrighteous just means someone who doesn't follow God's laws. And so Paul is saying, how can you bring a church issue or some personal issue, you as a Christian, to someone who doesn't necessarily is not tuned in to the way God does things? Why bring trivial matters to a world that sometimes handles these things in a way that's different than the way God's people should handle them? Think about this. How does the world deal with being wronged? If you read Twitter, there's a lot of great feuds that go on even between celebrities, because how the world handles minor offenses is slander and gossip, maybe threats, or if you grow up in California, lawsuits. Right? That's how the world handles it. And so Paul's saying, why would you bring it to that system? And in fact, the system back then favored the rich and the powerful, because the only ones who could be judges and lawyers were the rich and powerful. And the way that the system worked, if you were of lower class, you couldn't even bring a lawsuit to someone who's in the upper class. The upper class could sue the lower class, but the lower class was powerless to do anything to the upper class. So Paul's saying, why would you bring it to a system that doesn't have the interest in mind of what God thinks should occur and doesn't base their judgment on God's truth and love? Let me give you an example from the Bible. Think about the woman caught in adultery. How did they interpret the law? What should happen to the woman caught in adultery? Stoning, death. Right? The religious leaders of the day interpreted that if a woman was caught in adultery, she should be stoned. What did Jesus do? He said what? I don't condemn you. Just go and sin no more. In other words, Jesus, did he see her adultery as sin? Yes. But the way Jesus' judgment went is he offered a path to redemption. Now, you might be asking, wait, wasn't it God's law that she'd be stoned? Yes, we'll talk about next week, okay? But all I want you to see is even the religious leaders who thought they understand God's heart and law when face to face with how Jesus actually approached the situation was completely different. Right? And so why bring it to court when God has given us a different way, his way of dealing with such things? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31 says this, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." Let's leave that up there. So God's way, not the world's way, is that we take the bitterness and the anger that could result from someone wronging us and put it away. Put it aside. And that word for put it aside is related to the word that Paul used last week when he said, "Cast out that evil man from you." Get rid of the guy sleeping with his mother-in-law. And so the implication here is all that bitterness you have, all that anger that you have, you need to find a way and let God empower you to cast it aside as far away from your heart as possible. It's serious. Right? So God's way is that we take the feelings and the reactions that we have, that we rightfully naturally have when wronged, those feelings and reactions that can be detrimental to us or detrimental to the church, and put it away and instead be kind and instead forgive. That we as a people are not to keep track of right and wrong, you know? Like I hear a lot of married couples do this, is they'll remember how they were wronged in the past. So when they're in the middle of the argument, someone will pull out that card and say, "Oh yeah? Well, on January 3rd, 2013, you did this. You did the same exact thing. And you were wearing this." And you know, like, how do you remember? We're called not to keep track of rights and wrongs. But instead, I know this is a little bit flippant, but in the wise words of Elsa, we need...
Let it go. I am one with the wind and sky. Let it go. Let it go. You'll never see me cry.
That's a bit too long. Okay, right? That's and I realize that's not easy. Look, I'm a guy, okay? And typically guys are just like, "Oh, whatever." You know, I understand this is not easy. But all I want us to see is that God calls us as a church to operate in a way that is very different from the way the world reacts to conflict. Okay? Paul goes on in, before we go on. So just think about that. When we deal with conflict, do we handle it in a biblical way? Or are we tempted to slander someone? Are we tempted to be bitter against someone? Or do we confront our conflict with love? Do we pray about it? Right? Because sometimes I want to fix someone with my words. I want to fix someone with the confrontation. But really, maybe it's something we should pray about. Okay? So in verse 2, Paul says, "Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more then matters pertaining to this life?" Okay, so that word judge means that to rule or govern. And okay, this is a little tricky because basically what it's saying is we're going to rule or govern the world, and then it says we'll rule or govern the angels. What the heck does that mean? Okay, there's very little agreement on that. So let me give you just one way to think about that. There was a Jewish understanding, if you read Daniel chapter 10, that there were these angels that were sort of put in charge of nations. That there were these angels that were given spiritual charge over nations. So one way to read that is it's actually saying the same thing, that God is going to have you judge the world and judge nations, or rule and govern the world, or rule and govern nations. Okay, but all that aside, because there's a lot of disagreement about what this means, the main point is this. God is going to empower us to rule at some point, right, later on. God is going to empower us to govern and to judge. And so, of course, in light of that, he will give us wisdom in handling these trivial matters as well. And so we can keep it in-house. Do you remember in Exodus 18, Moses was spending his whole day making decisions for people, and they were bringing up trivial matters. I don't know what they were, like, oh, you know, he stole my manna, or You know, like I don't know what you would argue about when you're traveling in the desert, okay? But his father-in-law Jethro sees how unwise this is because it's taking up his whole time. And in Exodus 18:19, here's what it says. His father-in-law Jethro says, "Now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God. And you shall warn them about the statutes and laws and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do. Moreover, look for able men from all people who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And let them judge," there's that word, "the people at all times. Every great matter they shall bring to you, but any small matter," which is what we're talking about, "they shall decide themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden for you." Verse 23, "If you do this, God will direct you, and you will be able to endure, and all this people also will go to their place in peace." And so what we need to realize is God is going to give us within the church wisdom so that we could settle things that might bring disunity. And what I want you to notice is that the person that is the peacekeeper and the judge is not just the pastor, not just the leader. Keeping unity and handling conflicts is this distributed responsibility. Besides, in every church I've been to, everyone has a problem with the pastor. Right? There's never been a pastor that I've worked with or been with where everyone doesn't have some sort of conflict, okay? And so that's why keeping unity can't just be about the pastor, because maybe you're mad at the pastor, which is not me, okay? But keeping unity needs to be this distributed responsibility with these trivial issues, right? And so maybe some of us will be called, and I say that very emphatically, to be a peacekeeper in some situation. Maybe some of us will be given the wisdom in how to be a peacekeeper and a judge and have some sort of wisdom in some situation. Called, okay? Not you insert yourself into it. And, because that might not be the best thing. In verse 4, he goes on, "So if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between brothers?" Okay? Paul here is criticizing their love of what again? This has been a theme. See if you've been paying attention. Why do I even bother? Wisdom, right? They loved wisdom. And so Paul is mocking them. He's saying, if you're so wise, if you think that you're so wise and you're so caught up in wisdom, then isn't there anybody wise enough among you to handle disputes, to handle conflicts? In verse 6, "But a brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers." But the thrust of the argument here that I want us to see is that Paul is saying, because of who you are, because you will judge, because you will govern, because of your future trajectory, you as a church can handle things very differently than the world. Because you will judge the world in the future, you will be empowered now to deal with conflict in the church. It's this very future-oriented reality. It's allowing our eternity to govern and guide the decisions we make in the present. It's allowing our understanding of our eternity to guide and govern our decisions in the present. Because I think that if we really understood our trajectory in eternity and what we'll be doing in eternity, our choices would be very different. It's this future-oriented way of looking at what's happening now. And I say this because our view of eternity is what will help us make sense of the last few verses in our passage. Look at what verse 7 and 8 says. "To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded but you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brothers. Why not rather be wronged? Listen, without keeping your eternity in mind, that phrase makes no sense. Without understanding where our eternity is heading, that makes no sense. Because unless we have in mind what our life with God in the future forever will look like, it is hard to have a good perspective of how petty some of the things are that we argue about, or how petty some of the things are that we hold on to and invest energy and anger and bitterness towards. When you know what? In the long run, a lot of that's not going to matter. In the long run, if somebody owes me money, I am not going to care about that when I'm in the presence of God. In the long run, if someone spreads some sort of false rumor about me within the church, that's not going to matter in the long run, in the eternity that I'm going to spend with God. Right? I'm not saying we just ignore it. We'll talk about that later, okay? But without a view of eternity, you know what we're always going to try to do? We're always going to try to fix things and bring about the justice that we feel we deserve. Without a view of eternity, we will always try and try and try to fix the other person who offended us and bring about the justice that we feel we deserve instead of trusting God's wisdom and judgment. There was a story in the news. Did you hear about this DNA test? If you haven't heard about it, this is great. This was hilarious. A female college student in Taipei demanded 18,000 NT in DNA testing on herself and 5 roommates to catch the culprit who drank her 59 NT bottle of yogurt, reported Apple Daily. Okay? A female undergraduate student at Chinese Culture University in Taipei recently discovered that one of her bottles of yogurt had been pilfered from the communal refrigerator and been consumed by one of her 5 roommates without her permission. But no one stepped forward to claim responsibility. Furious, the woman plucked the empty bottle from the trash bin and took it to the police station, where she asked investigators to carry out costly DNA forensics tests to catch the offending roommate. And by law, the police had to spend $18,000. And they did catch who it was that drank the yogurt. Okay? Now, the story seems absurd. I read this, I'm like, that's so crazy. But it's sort of satisfying, isn't it? Like, it comes from this natural desire that we have to be vindicated, and this sort of God-given desire that we have for justice. Justice was done. Okay, now it cost the taxpayers $18,000, but justice, you know? But in light of eternity, we sometimes have to remember that justice isn't always our job, right? Sometimes justice, for certain situations, that's God's job to execute on His timing and in His wisdom. So this suggestion to suffer wrong without getting justice is one of understanding that eternity. It's not ignoring the offense. It's the situation where you've done all you can, you've confronted the person, you've gone through the biblical steps of confrontation, and maybe that person has no indication of changing. And maybe there's no indication of resolution. And so Paul says, why not rather be wronged? You know, I know we don't want to hear this, but there are some things that we've been hurt by and some things that others have done within the church to us, and we want revenge or we want justice. But that might never happen. Or it might be that getting justice actually disrupts the unity. I'm talking about within the church, okay? How you handle people outside the church should also be in line with this, but we're talking just within the church for now. So the question is really not how we can achieve justice, but how we can instead trust God and let go or go through the process of forgiveness, the process of not needing that vindication. A more serious story occurred a couple weeks ago where a 20-year-old driver, if you've seen this in the news, he fears that he will face a big compensation bill after dozing off and crashing into a group of 4 Ferraris. sports cars in New Taipei City. Around 5 a.m., Mr. Lin was driving a Mitsubishi SUV loaded with goods for delivery in the Shiding district. When he began to doze off and veered left, sideswiping a yellow Ferrari parked on the roadside. The yellow Ferrari belonged to a man named Yang, who was one of 4 parked in a row. There's 4 Ferraris parked in a row. After the owners had gathered to make a run to Yilan on the Beiyi Highway, Highway 5. The SUV then crashed into the back right-hand side of the white Ferrari, which in turn hit a blue Ferrari, and the blue Ferrari touched a red Ferrari, but fortunately only damaged the license plate. The owner of the red Ferrari said he will not be seeking compensation for his license plate. Mr. Lin, however, will face claims from the owners of the other 3 sports cars, according to a report in the United Daily News. The report quotes an expert who, after viewing the photographs, estimated that repair costs would be at least 5.6 million NT. Okay, now here's what I want to bring up, okay? Do they have a right to the compensation? They have a legal right to the compensation. They're owed it. Justice would be that they get paid for the damages caused by this truck driver, right? But wouldn't the world take notice? Or maybe not, because they're rich. But wouldn't the world take notice if they just forgave the debt? Wouldn't it be a great testimony if they just forgave and didn't get the justice they deserved? I think that would make some pretty interesting news. But here's the thing. If you've been wronged, or if you have conflict with someone within the church, it's actually not best to think of yourself as the Ferrari owner forgiving your millions of NT damage. If you're someone who's been wronged, it's actually better to understand that you're the truck driver. And it's better to understand that because the truck driver now has a debt that he has no chance of repaying. And I think if we keep in mind that we were people that before God had a debt that we had no chance of repaying, and yet God forgave us, I think that goes a long way in empowering us to also forgive. So why not rather be wronged? You know, in light of the fact that we're forgiven, why not forgive? In order to preserve the unity within this body, why not rather be wronged? In light of eternity, in light of what we're going to be doing, why not rather be wronged? Right? Because we have God's ultimate and perfect justice that we can trust in, why not in some situations, if God calls you to just let it go, why not rather be wronged? Right? There is a story in Matthew chapter 18 where Peter goes up to Jesus and said, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. And then he goes on and tells this parable about the servant, which if you haven't read it in a while, I would encourage you to read it. But it's a story of understanding that we had this insurmountable debt. And the servant in the story had trouble forgiving a tiny debt. And so, kind of in light of this, we have to understand that God's call on us is not to fix the other person. God's call on us is not to change the other person and help them realize the error of our ways, because that's really, in some ways, God's job. God's call to us in some situations is not even that we bring justice. And there are things where God will use us to bring justice. But God's call in some situations actually is that we do something in our own hearts. God's call is that we take action to let him empower us through maybe the process of forgiveness. And maybe the process of just letting go of certain things. And not that it's easy. C.S. Lewis, I read a letter C.S. Lewis wrote where he admitted that it took him 30 years to forgive someone. 30 years of prayer, okay? I don't think C.S. Lewis was just sitting there bitter. I think he was trying. It took him 30 years to forgive someone. Right? And so it's not easy. But with God, it's a possibility. And I think in some situations, it's a better choice. I think this is what the church should look like. Yes, there's conflicts. Yes, we will not always agree and get along. But in the end, we're forgiven people who, through God's power, can forgive. Can we close our eyes and